Welcome back. I'm that chemist, and today we're going to talk about how to properly reference in a research paper. Now, today we're not talking so much about styles for referencing, but rather the rationale for why you would reference certain ways versus other ways, and why some methods matter and other ones don't. So, when you're writing a research paper, there's several different reasons why you might reference some previous work. And so one reason would be that that paper you're referencing was like fundamental for the work that you're doing now. Let's say that it's an extension of prior work, you want to put things in context. Okay, great. That's a totally valid reason to reference something. Now, if somebody else did something similar recently, it's also good to include references so that other people can see, okay, yeah, there's work going on in this field. This is a little bit weaker because that other paper didn't necessarily contribute anything to this paper. You're not necessarily using their chemistry, you're just acknowledging them. So that's like a little bit weaker of a citation, but it counts the same, but it shouldn't count the same. It's a little bit weaker. We actually don't have a good way to say like this type of reference matters and this type of reference doesn't, which is actually an existing systemic issue throughout science right now. Because if I develop a reagent and other people use it, that should be cited much higher than someone saying, oh yeah, Billy Bob over there, he did some chemistry recently. It's like, cool story, bro. That, unless you're using Billy Bob's chemistry, I don't really know why I should care. And so, a really bad reason to reference someone is you just want to suck up. And you see this all the time in research papers where essentially you see someone doing something similar, someone doing something completely unrelated but in the same field, and you're just giving them a reference. All this is doing is padding up their paper's reference count, doesn't mean that their science is being used at all, and this is kind of like pretty toxic for chemistry in my opinion. Now, that being said, I'm not saying that we haven't written papers where we do the same thing. I think everybody's guilty of this, but it's an issue that needs to be addressed. Now, another good reason why you would reference someone's work is that there is fundamental work in the field that inspired this work. So you see someone do one thing, maybe that gives you an idea to do something else, you can reference that work. That's a valid reason, right? If someone, builds the first half of the pyramid and you build the second half, it's important to reference that as well. Now, the distinction between this and prior work is like fundamental work could tell you why this matters. So let's say that a fluorinated derivative of an amino acid was useful in some bioassay or something, then that would inspire you to maybe make more fluorinated amino acids, right? Like that's a valid reason why you'd say this is important, this matters. Now, this can go too far if you are highlighting just recent work in the field that isn't necessarily related to your paper. And so like the less related the papers that you're referencing are to your work, the less they should be included. Especially since this isn't a research review article. This is just an original research article. There's a time and a place for reviews, and that's in a review article. You can have a little bit of background, but if you're working with fluoride, you don't need to be talking about electrophilic fluorinating agents. That's excessive. All you're doing is trying to pad up how, like, this is such an important area. There's so much interest. It's like you can just cite a review and let somebody go and read that review. And if that review doesn't exist, go write that review because people aren't going to read your article as a review. So just go write a review. There's a place and a time for each type of article. Now, if there's important background, like I was saying the fluorinated amino acid thing before, like if there's valid background behind your research, why it matters, it's important in agrochemistry, blah, 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 that's fine too, but this is still a little bit weaker. It gives credibility to why what you're doing matters, but that being cited isn't necessarily as valid, okay? So there's some sins that you can commit when doing research. If you're not acknowledging prior work, so let's say you're using fundamental stuff and you don't cite that in your main paper, that is a sin. If you're not comparing and contrasting your method to existing methods, that's a sin as well because you're not addressing that other people have done work and maybe you're trying to make your chemistry seem really good by just totally ignoring other people who've published in that area. That is not cool at all, and people who see that will hate it, right? Just be honest. Be honest about how good your research is, right? And not referencing fundamental work. So if there's fundamental work that leads to why your work matters, you need to be citing it. And also, if you don't provide context, it's not good for readers who are non-experts. So you need to have a little bit of context, but that doesn't mean you need to write a whole review. Just like a couple sentences here and there just to say like, this is kind of why this matters. If you want to read more, here's a review that will provide you with input, or here's a paper that will provide you with more input. Okay, so there are times when a citation belongs in a manuscript and when it belongs in an SI, a supporting information. So we just talked about why certain citations belong in a manuscript. So let's say that you have made a substrate for your scope, just a starting material, but it wasn't commercially available. You had to make it, and so you made it using a literature procedure. It is appropriate to include that in the SI. It's not fundamental to the paper working necessarily, especially if you're doing a methods paper, so this would be a time when it's appropriate to reference something in the SI. Additionally, if you are making new substrates using an adaptation of prior work, it's good to cite that work because that's actually evidence that that work mattered, right? Like you're using a method somebody developed on a new substrate. That's a very, very, very valid reference. That's probably more valid than most of the references we just talked about, right? Because this is saying, I actually use their work for the thing that I'm doing. And maybe the SI references actually matter more than the manuscript references. And I would argue that they do. And there's an issue that most publishers don't actually look at the SI and take those references or even like index them anywhere. And even like JAX and most of the ACS journals would be examples of this. So if for instance your main reagent that you're using in your paper was previously reported and it wasn't commercially available, and you don't cite it in the main part of your manuscript and you only cite it in the SI, that seems really disingenuous because it seems like you're claiming that that reagent is your own, even if you aren't outright doing so. And so I think this is important to highlight for the editors of certain journals that have already been mentioned because, maybe referencing a reagent only in your SI, but talking about how useful it is in your whole paper is a little bit hypocritical, don't you think? If you disagree with me, let me know down below. So let's get to the animations for today. So here's the first example. So Bob did something similar recently. Bob's work. Okay, and then we look at our work, and so you see we've added color to ours so that it highlights, wow, ours is useful. Maybe we're kind of minimizing what Bob actually did, and we're trying to make ours look as good as possible. This is the typical type of thing you see in a table of contents graphic, a TOC graphic. Now, another reason would be like Bob is a well known chemist and he did chemistry in this field. So you just talk about Bob's work, but it has absolutely nothing to do with your work. And you can see Bob is outstanding in his field, literally. Another thing would be like if you didn't know how this chemistry worked, but you reported it, some guy figured out how it works. Like Bob figured this out, Bob rationalized the chemistry. An example of this would be the chemist who determined the structure of ferrocene ended up winning the Nobel Prize, whereas another chemist had prepared ferrocene and didn't know its structure. And so if you do a paper subsequently that just talks about that, that could be like another case, right? So here would be theoretical work explaining why that rationale is right. And there's a little joke here that you could pause and look at if you missed it. And so another type of reference, as we were saying earlier, would be highlighting the importance of a certain area. And so here, this would be like, this is the importance of fluorine. And then you have some reference which gets cited a billion times because it's a review. Now, if someone's done prior work that's relevant that inspired your work, you should cite them as well. So here you can see Bob, this guy who's outstanding in his field. He has done a Diels-Alder reaction, and so you decided, oh, I'm going to do an analog of this where instead of having a carbon double bond, I have a sulfur double bond carbon, and so this would be like another reason why you'd reference someone. Now, then there's cases where you see references just totally like roast someone, and you could do this diplomatically. You can let the reader figure out on their own which chemistry is better, especially if they're experienced. You don't have to just, outright roast people. But quite often you see people really minimizing other people's chemistry, and maybe it's because the chemistry is bad, but that doesn't mean you have to be a meanie about it, right? And so here's an example where I've just made this up, but this probably exists in a paper somewhere, where you can see a binap-derived acid is reduced with a Hansch ester, or is used as a catalyst in this reduction with a Hansch ester. And maybe you could just do that with carrots instead, who's to say? And oftentimes this is like, colored where the other ones aren't so that you look at their stuff and not other people's work. It's like a little bit toxic though. And maybe there should be a practice where whenever we submit figures in a paper to a journal, there's like no color and minimized style so that you're not pumping it up, right? Pumping it up full of air. And so one case recently was, there's this report of a reagent that Bob made. So this is Bob's reagent. And then some other guy came along and ended up treating this with this reagent and used something like ball milling and got this trifluoromethyl ether. And so this is a recent paper that actually came out in JAX, but it was inspired by our original work that was in Orglet, where we made these quaternary ammonium trifluoromethoxide salts. And so here you can see one figure from our paper where you can see we made several different salts with OCF3 and quaternary ammonium. And then this new paper came out from these naughty nuggets who made these pyridinium salts and under mechanochemical conditions were able to convert them to trifluoromethyl ethers. And this was in JAX. However, I want to highlight here that within the whole body of their manuscript, we are not cited even once. And I was not notified when this was published because I don't have notifications set up for SIs because you can't do that. Jax doesn't list any references in their SIs in any sort of index, so you just don't get emailed. It's almost as if the reference doesn't exist. It's even worse is when they directly outright quoted our reagents and they didn't provide any citations in the text whatsoever. They just talk about these reagents as if they're novel. Now, they don't claim that they're novel, but they don't claim that they're previously reported. And as stated earlier, if your research builds on prior work, you have the duty to reference that work. And so here you can see they did give us the slightest reference in their SI, where they said these reagents were prepared according to the literature described procedure, where they use 4 of our reagents that we prepared. Now, if you remember from the previous video where we talked about what's in a good SI, which I'll include a link to here, one of the best things to do is if you re-prepare something that's already been reported, it's good to include the conditions and all of the characterization for those compounds, especially for something that's being used for the first time by a new group. That's like really validating that the original work was useful. But in this case, they didn't do that. So that's like a little bit disappointing. Nonetheless, I hope that this has been an interesting and entertaining video for you about why referencing matters and when you should and shouldn't reference. And if you're interested in discussing any of these matters further, I'm always available on the Discord. Thank you for watching. It would help out the channel if you liked and subscribed, and I hope you have a great day.